G'day everybody, and for those who are coming late, you're listening to Expand the Phantom Podcast.
500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die." The Phantom! The ghost who walks. The Phantom. Enemies beware. The Phantom's always there, but you won't find the Phantom. He finds you.
We are the Expand the Phantom Podcast from Chronicle Chamber. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can contact us via our email, which is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. You can subscribe to us via our YouTube, or iTunes, or Android apps. This is episode 172, titled Our Top 10 Villains. My name is Jermayn, and today I am joined by Dan. How are you, Dan?
Very good, Jermayn. Very good. Good to be back on the pod. I've missed being on for a while. It feels like a long time.
Yeah, it has. It's and again another shout out to Matt Kine with his reviews. It's helped us. 2020 has been a crazy year for everyone. And so it's been nice to be able to have some help, just ensuring we've got some regular podcasts as well. So so again, a huge shout out, and good to have you back on board, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. It is good to get the help on the podcast and the website, which is why we're now reaching back. What is it, 13, 14 years to someone who's helped in the past?
No, and it must be said that we've been talking about this for close to about a year and a half, talking about this specific podcast.
Yep.
And when we were talking to Grange just recently, 3-4 podcasts ago, he mentioned villains and a rogues gallery. And we kind of laughed and giggled, and we said, "Oh yeah, we got something in the planning stage." And that wasn't just us just pulling it and making it up. We actually did have it. So back in 2007, Paul Jonassen, I'll get him to correct that pronunciation in a second, who a big Norwegian fan, wrote for Chronicle Chamber his top 10 villains. Now, when we kind of came back on it, we thought, oh, that's interesting. And then we kind of talked about what our top 10 villains were, and we thought, well, 13 years later, we're going to have to relook at this list. And then we're going to have to do our own. So, and then what we thought is, why don't we get Paul on board, and then he can talk about his top 10 and whether it's actually changed 13 years later. So, howdy, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me here.
Now, first thing first, we ask every guest this. Can you pronounce your last name for us?
Well, if I'm going to try using the Norwegian pronunciation, it's Paul Jonassen. But you can say Paul Jonassen is probably the closest. So just go with Paul. That's easier.
Okay. So are you like the Norwegian brother of the Jonas Brothers?
Yeah. I wish I had the money of the Jonas Brothers at least, but I don't think I have the musical talent or the money. So I don't think that's the case.
Paul, you said you're in Norway. Whereabouts in Norway?
I reside on the west coast of Norway, and on Norway's biggest island. I have lived here all my life, basically, and not much interesting happens. So when I was, I think around 10 years old, I picked up my first Phantom comic, and I was kind of hooked for life. Have been a big fan since then. That was back in 1999, I think. So it's been some years.
So you're a young fella. So
yes.
So there's not many young fellas out there. You might be one of the youngest Phantom fans out there.
Yes, I think. I've noticed Dan's son has been on some of these podcasts, so there are some younger than me. But I'm 31 years old now, so I guess that makes me like a junior Phantom fan still.
But building an impressive collection, mate. I do like the look of those posters and the folders of comics behind you there. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you. I have even more that you can't see on the phone now. I started collecting intensely right after picking up my first comic book, and I never really looked back. I have most of the stories published in Norwegian, and as many as I have been able to find in English. And like now, I'm only subscribing to the Frus, which are wonderful, I think. Throughout Ivan Peterson's IP Comics. So I highly recommend other people do the same, because I think even though the Norwegian comic was cancelled, it's been 2 years, I think, now. It's still possible to get your Phantom fix through Ivan, so I highly recommend that.
And you
Yes.
just that's IP Comics on Facebook is probably the easiest way for people to find him in, isn't it?
Yes, probably. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And he does a good service for not only as a colorist for Fru, but as a distributor in Europe. So absolutely.
I think it's the only way of getting. I think it's basically the only way of getting them. Well, at least here in Norway, because they don't. I don't think they allow you to subscribe to it directly from Fru. Well, it's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you and I, Paul, we've known each other since what? We were doing the maths 15, 20 years ago is when we first connected via the old Clinton forum. And all the old timers will remember that with fond memories.
Yes. That was a great time of being a fan. And I think back in the day, interacting with fans through the forum, it made me... It kind of took my interest in this character to a whole new level. So it was just great. I think there were so many people using those forums too for years and years.
Yeah. Now, others, some people may not know, but you've actually been in a Phantom comic.
Yes, I was. There was this competition on the Moonstone, old Moonstone website, like I think it was in 2005 or 2006 or something, where you were supposed to write it was basically a Phantom short story or something. And I won the competition. They gave me some really cool prizes. But the coolest one was by far being drawn into a Phantom comic. The first part of the Checkmate storyline, if anybody remembers that one. It was a 5-part story. So I was the Phantom's driver. I drove the Walker family to the airport in the issue. And in a couple of issues later, I actually wound up dead, which was which was a strange honor, I think. The bad guy, which I may or may not have included on my list because of this, he actually threatened Diana, I think, by showing her a video or a photo or something of my dead body to show what he was capable of doing. So that was. So I kind of became a plot device, I guess.
Very cool. And you just mentioned the list. Then, how did you actually come to? How did you come to send it in to Joe Douglas? I suppose for him to publish on the website at the time, or what was your involvement in Chronicle Chamber then?
I basically contributed with many articles back in those days when he was running the website, and this was one of must have been at least 10, I think.
Right.
So it's been so many years, so I can't remember why I decided to sit down with that. But it seemed like a fun thing to do, I guess. And it was just as it looked like a fun thing to do now again, because my list is quite different now.
That was going to be one of our questions. Is one of the things I've been looking forward to is how different your list is going to be. So So on
some of the choices are the same.
Yeah, on the podcast we will have a list we will include everyone's list. We've got Stephen's list as well, who sadly couldn't make it tonight. And then we will include the to the article that you originally wrote as well.
Cool.
Should we go over your original 10 and then we'll start the discussion?
I don't have the original 10 in front of me, so maybe you have.
I've got the original 10 in front of me. Okay, so at first you had Lubunga, which is from the Lubunga series. Number 2, you had General Bababu. 3, you had Dogai Singh. 4, you had Rolf Mars, which was from the Australian created Marvel series.
Yeah.
5, you had Baron Grover. Number 6, you had Bale, which is from the Golden Rune series. 7, you had Rama Singh, who killed the 20th Phantom. Number 8, you had Sala. Number 9, you had Goldhan. And number 10, you had the Marshall sisters.
Yes, I think that was mostly intended as a joke entry, almost, but they really challenged the Phantom in their own way, so I guess they could count as villain.
Yeah,
several stories.
So Dan, what do you think about that original 10?
Oh, I actually remember one of my first jobs when I first came on. One of the things I first took upon when I first came onto the team was to Joe had only just changed websites from something to Wix, and so we had all of the old articles in a blog form, but not updated for the new website. And so one of the first things I did was to bring a lot of those across, and I distinctly remember playing with Paul's because putting in the photo, sourcing and or putting in photos and formatting the article. It's the one that really stands out because it was really entertaining to go back and look through all of those old villains. So that's sort of why it stuck with me, and I'm very happy to be doing this tonight. And it's always fun, of course, to go back and think about the bad guys and all the different stories that you've enjoyed. I've probably used I've probably tweaked the criteria a little bit. We maybe need to discuss what's in and what's out in terms of different types of bad guys, I suppose. But I'd be interested to know, I guess. Okay, so one of the questions I'd have is you've listed a couple of Singhs there separately, Paul. I probably would like to list the Singh organisation and cover all of them. So are we including just individuals, or are you allowed to have organisations as well?
I didn't really think that far. I only included individuals because the Singh Brotherhood. There has been so many cool villains introduced as members of the Brotherhood that it seems kind of a shame to not mention them individually to me in that way.
No, that's fair. What did you do, Jerm?
It's a good question. There's been some great chat and banter as we've prepared for this podcast. Personally, I've done a mixture of both in my top 10. With the Singh, I've listed them individually purely because there's probably been more attention paid to them individually rather than some other organisations, which I'm sure we'll discuss as we list our 10. So I think you could probably do a bit of both. Like for instance, in Paul's original, he had Rama Singh and Dogai Singh.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure there will probably be a couple of other Singh brothers. There might be Kigali Singh, which was the first major villain. There's probably even maybe Sandal Singh, which may be presented in a couple of people's top 10s as well. But I think they're probably more individuals, but then there's going to be probably some organisations where we don't really know who the head guy is or something that may have to be an organisation.
Right. So you're having your cake and eating it too, is what you're saying?
Yeah. I want to do a Stephen and sit on the fence on that one. Big shout out to Stephen. But I've got another question regarding Paul's original list. He's included the Marshall sisters and Sala. So my question is do the anti-heroes like Sala or the Marshall sisters belong in that list? And what about reformed bad guys or girls like Big Steve from the Shark's Nest, Fifi from the Golden Circle, Sala from the Cyban, and Susie, even to an extent, from the Governor and Susie, who started off as bad guys and then became good guys or became helpers of the Phantom? Do they belong on the list?
I don't think I would have included any of them today. Back in the day when I wrote the list, there was still, since then there have been several Moonstone stories and at least one Egmont story, if I remember correctly, featuring Sala, which kind of, she's not really the bad guy of any of them. She's more like a helper of the Phantom that has some, she has a shady career of in all of them, but she's definitely not out to get the Phantom in any way. So I don't think I would have counted her today as a villain personally.
Dan?
I think there's all merit to them being classed as villains, but they're probably in a slightly different category of villain, and certainly none of them have appeared on my top 10. So I think there's lots of more malevolent and bad guys that are out there that would better suit a rogues gallery if that's what we were looking to create. So yeah.
All right, and then I got another question. One of the beauties about the Phantom, and we've made mention of this millions of times, is that there's past Phantoms, and we've even seen a couple of future Phantoms. So did anyone include past villains or future villains in their top 10s? And how do you juggle that? Are we just talking about the 21st Phantom, or are we talking about the Phantom as a collective 27 generations from the first Phantom to the Defenders of the Earth Phantom?
I included villains of the past, and one of the most impressive things of following the Phantom is that it's such an epic story of spanning 500 years almost that I would be disappointed if I couldn't include some of the historical ones.
Yeah, I'm on that page too. Like I certainly didn't discount anyone from the future, but I haven't got them. I think Steve might, if I've browsed his list correctly. 4 of mine are villains that the past Phantoms would have battled as well. So I've certainly brought them in.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions about creating criteria or anything, or did we want to get started on our lists?
Well, I did put...
yeah, sorry. No, you first.
Right, Paul, you go.
No, you first. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. That's all right. I was just going to say that I included 3. I sort of had 3 dot points for myself. They had to be a memorable villain, and I needed to be fond of the stories that they were in. I wanted to be remember them happily or enjoyably. And third, I wanted the villains to have the prospect of creating new stories as well to be used by into the future. So that's probably the three criteria I had.
Yeah, no, that's a good criteria. What was your criteria, Paul?
Basically, my only criteria was that they were first and foremost the villains should be memorable. The ones I picked are the ones that kind of stuck in my mind for some reason or the other. Not all of them might have been the biggest threats to the Phantom, and they might not have stuck around in the comic for too long. But it's just something about them that hooked me, that made them stand out in one way or another.
Mine had to be that it had to cause the Phantom trouble. Like, it had to be... And let's be honest, if we were to be honest about the Phantom and the Rogues Gallery, is that a lot of the time the Phantom tends to defeat the bad guys a little bit too easily, and they don't reappear. Now, I'm glad we don't have where the Phantom battles the same villain in every single issue, like like Batman and Joker. I would hate to be reading 1,000 stories about Batman defeating Joker. That kind of gets old after a little while. Sorry, Batman fans out there. So for me, they had to be memorable in a sense of how they challenged the Phantom or even defeated the Phantom. Like, for instance, in my list, I've got 2 people that actually, well, I've kind of got a list of 15 here.
Okay, so I also have more than 10. Here's what I did. I've separated out my honourable mentions. Yeah. And so I think you probably need to do that pretty swiftly.
Yeah. So in my list of 14, 15, including the honourable mentions, there's 2 that have actually killed the Phantom. So for me, they're honourable because of the way it happened. So that's one of the criteria for me. And then another one, like what you said, Dan, you have to be able to enjoy the story. Like, the story has to be enjoyable where you go back and reread it. And, you know, and I also liked stories where he has come back, or not just like a one-hit wonder story. Yeah. So where it's just like you get one story and that's it, you never see him again. I think all of mine, there's been more than one story featuring that Phantom. So that was kind of how I did mine.
I was just a little comment on what you said about the rogues gallery of the Phantom being a little more. Usually it's a one and done deal. But that also makes the opponents that stick around seem more formidable, basically, like the Singh Brotherhood, because they are. Like Batman is, you mentioned Batman and the Joker. When a bad guy sticks around for that long and terrorizes the hero so frequently, it only makes the hero look a little ineffective, I think. But with the Phantom, there has been, even the recurring villains haven't been, none of them have been overused in the way that the Joker has in Batman comics. So it makes it makes it feel a little more believable, basically.
That is a good point, and one I hadn't really thought about. But a Phantom villain probably does need to have an actual shelf life, where, you know, at the end of the day, whether it's the next generation or a toughened up version of the same one, as long as the villain gets the comeuppance in the end, that's So you might be right. Maybe it'd be interesting to have a look at. I think Python might have like 13 daily stories about him. I'm not sure how many. Team Farnerman, but maybe again, you know, is that enough? It's certainly more than Babu was the 4th most used villain. So, well,
I think it's a very good point. Like, I think Dogai Singh, for example, I think he's probably been the most used villain, and he's effectively been put on ice.
Literally.
So, you know, I think it's probably good that he's been put on ice, that he's, because he did get a little bit long in the tooth towards the end. He almost became the Batman's Joker, where it's like, oh, great, here we go again. It's Dogai Singh, and he's going to fail again. So, yeah.
Well, that said, I think there's still a lot of scope for, in the back catalogue of the Phantom, for characters who aren't overused yet. And I guess that speaks to my third criteria. Like, every one of the characters I'm going to mention tonight, I'd love to see another story or 2 at least, and sometimes another 6 or 10.
Cool. All right. Anything else you want to add? Or I'm thinking we maybe list 10 to 6, and then we'll kind of have a bit of a discussion. Or do you want to list all 10? How do you just want to do it?
I think the way you suggested sounds good for me.
Yeah.
Like 10 to 6, maybe.
Okay, so Paul, do you want to go first, mate, as our guest?
Yes, I can do that. Just list 10 to 6.
Yep.
On number 10, my choice was a villain called Goldhan, who appeared in 2 Egmont stories. One in the 70s, I think, and the sequel was released in 1998 or something. And number 9, I had Chandra Singh, who we should all know by now.
Okay, can we stop you there? Ask you a question.
Oh, yes.
Is the Sun the Phantoms or not?
I know that is controversial on this podcast, so I'm not sure if I dare to. I think it's probably best that it is left ambiguous, but I think it's there seems to be a strong possibility that he is, but I think it might be best if they never actually resolve that one and keep it up in the air, because it's kind of interesting to keep guessing. So I don't think the answer would satisfy. I mean, no matter what you do, you end up alienating a lot of the fans. So because there's like two very opposing camps around this question, I guess.
That's perhaps the ultimate fence-sitting response, Paul. Well done. Not just should they. We should never know.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. You keep going.
Yeah, it's a good question though. On number 8, I had Chatu / the Python, and number 7, I had this guy called Camel from the DC. He appeared in 4 DC stories. And on number 6, I have what I think will be the most original choice of any of these lists, maybe, because it's the evil grandmother from the Castle of Evil story, or rather her evil twin sister pretending to be the evil grandmother. She's called Irma. I'm not sure if you even remember the story, but it's this horror story by Norman Werker and Hans Lindahl.
What was the name of the story again?
The Castle of Evil is what it's called in Norwegian, and the Phantom Wiki told me it was called that in English too.
Oh, I think I know the one you're talking about. Is that a 1988 story?
1988, yes. It's
is that
basically
Red Riding Hood?
Yes, correct. The horror version of the Red Riding Hood, where the Phantom and Jacob Grimm, who wrote the fairy tale, I believe, they meet the inspiration for the fairy tale.
Oh, that is a real.
Well, you're right. That's going to be very unique. I don't have that.
Yeah. Have you read it, Dan?
I'm trying to scan through the summary on Phantom Wiki. It's one of the better summaries. Did you write this, Paul? Because it's one of the best.
I didn't.
Lots of the stories have very little in the way of a summary, and this one's too extensive for me to read in a hurry. It doesn't spring to mind immediately, no.
I know the story.
Good.
It's quite spooky.
It's terrifying.
I remember reading it as a child, and as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, and almost being freaked out. Like it was.
Yes, me too.
I will admit, I've never been someone who's liked horror movies, just purely because I just don't get it. But it's a great story. It's quite freaky.
So I think it probably has the best artwork that Hans Lindahl ever did, which is saying something. So it's. But I guess we can talk more about it when we later, if you'd like. Or
no, I was just going to say for Australian listeners, it's through number 1047, which came out in 1993. And Jerm, from what I know of your getting into the fandom, that would have been the first year or so that you were reading through regularly.
It was probably in 94, 95 was when I started, so it was just before. So.
I picked up,
like when I first started collecting, I brought an old collection off someone, so it was in there. So, I was quite lucky that I picked up like 300 comics, pretty much straight away, within 6 months of collecting it. So, it's a very spooky story. That's a great, so why did you choose that?
Well, basically it's, I think the story is probably in my top 10 of the ones I've read the most, at least. And there is something about I think if it was drawn by anybody else than Hans Lindahl, the character might not have stuck out in the way she did for me. But he has, I've heard people saying that Hans Lindahl draws rubber faces, and he kind of takes that to the extreme with that character, because she is... she just looks terrifying the way he draws her there's a scene with her eating a chicken or something like that. That is just gives me the chills just thinking about it. He makes her so grotesque and frightening to look at that the visual deal is part of it, definitely. And then there's also the fact that she, the story strongly indicates that she is a werewolf. It's never said there directly, I think, but it's clear as day when you reach the ending that it is a supernatural story and that she's able to turn into a big killer wolf. So I just thought that was really cool. There's a scene near the end of the story where the phantom cuts of one of the paws of the wolf, and then you see her. This is a spoiler for a 30-year-old story, by the way. But then you see her. Then you see her lying on the ground later on in the story, missing a hand and stone dead. It really resonated with me as a child when I read it for the first time. Like you said, Jermayn, it was. I wasn't really into horror films either back in those days, but so the story might have had an even bigger effect on me because it was so. It's not a very kid-friendly story, basically.
Yeah, it's even got the Phantom butt naked as well, fighting a werewolf in his birthday suit.
Yes, I remember that. Did Jim Shepard draw underpants on him or something?
No, we saw the buttocks.
All right. Yeah.
There you go. Well, that sounds like you say, very left field pick, but very intriguing. I hope a lot of people seek out that story now and read it. I feel like I am keen to now.
I highly recommend it. It's a shame if it hasn't been reprinted in Australia, and I don't know if it has, but it definitely should.
Just the once in '93, and if we're putting fan comics in Coles supermarkets at the moment, we probably don't want to put that one in by the sounds of it.
No, maybe not. I can understand why, but it's just wonderful. So it's highly recommended to everybody.
You also picked Goldhan in 10th spot. Now,
yes.
As you've mentioned, my son Angus, that was one of the books that he's read when I gave him some of my my more fair copies of my seconds from the collection. And he really loved those two issues as well. So again, about 10 and a half, and he was really taken by the idea of this man with the golden hand.
Yes, that should have been the title, maybe. But yes, I'm basically I'm always a sucker for any story featuring colorful villains, because, like Jermayn said earlier most of the villains are one and done, and they are also most of the villains are kind of the Phantom fights more realistic villains than most costume heroes do. So the ones that have some sort of gimmick always end up sticking out for me somewhat. And this guy has lost his right hand, I believe, and he has replaced it with a golden hand. I think it's made of pure gold, which he also uses as a weapon. He's shown as a physically formidable foe in the first story he appeared in, where the Phantom, he only if I remember correctly, he only manages to beat him in the fight by pure luck. Goldhan is very close to killing off the Phantom, and that was pretty much the case in the sequel too, if I remember correctly. It's been many years since I read both of them.
Yeah. For me, what I liked about I prefer the first story of Goldhan. It was in the second story, he came across more of a deranged type of person, where he kind of lost that X factor, I guess, for lack of a better word, as in the first story. Because in the first story, he was a great villain. Second story, it was almost like, yeah, nice try bringing him back, but maybe it was better that we didn't see him. But yeah, really enjoyed the first story. I think it was Jamie Vale who did the first story?
I think it was
Bess. Yeah, George Bess.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry, what was that?
Were they different creative teams or different
Yeah.
writers?
So the first one was Goldhan. I'll pull up the stories for Australia. So issue 1215 in 98. Sweden there's been a number of times, same as Norway. So that was the first story, which was created by Jan Lundstrom and George Bess. And then the second one was The Return of the Goldhan, which was actually done by Tony D. Paul and Henya Bay, which was 1216 1998. So,
Yes.
Yeah, so they're quite close together.
That's interesting. Because as you were talking about the difference between the two stories, I was thinking about one thing that makes a great villain is a long-term scheme. And if the one author is able to write multiple stories about the same villain, then they've got a deeper end game. And perhaps, returning to the well when someone perhaps didn't expect a second story, so there was no real obvious tie-in, or certainly the same creator didn't have a part B in mind. So that's interesting to think about when I look at the other characters that I've got on my list.
Yeah. I like Camel. He's from the DC area. That's the regular series. He was the gun runner. For those who have come in late, we've had some great podcasts with Luke McDonald and Mark Vernhanen. So, if you enjoyed that character as well, we recommend you listening to those podcasts. He's a good villain.
I think he is. The reason I felt like I had to include one villain from the DC series because I find myself returning to those issues, all 13 issues again and again and again. I read them every couple of years, basically. And one of the reasons I picked him was that he was the only one that came back. He's the main villain in issue 1 and 2, and then he returns in 12 and 13, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And there is nothing particularly memorable about him, and he doesn't have like a gimmick or something like Goldhan, but he's just scary because he feels so real. He feels like he feels like the kind of guy you would see on the news every night, basically, profiting on war and destruction and other people's misery.
Yeah. He's like a cockroach. You just can't keep him away. He just keeps coming back and back. And No, that was a good one.
And then there's actually there is this wonderful section in the second issue he's in where he I reread it this summer, where he is. I don't think any villain has been shown to be more terrified of the Phantom than he is in that final issue, because he. Basically everything falls to pieces around him as the Phantom comes closer and closer, and finally he doesn't even get him in the end, but he has just terrified him. He has just terrified him so much that you get the sense that the Phantom has won anyway.
Yeah. Dan, anything you want to add to Paul's top 5, or otherwise we'll move on to Stephen's?
Yeah, I was thinking that we probably need, because the other two characters there are ones that I know we're going to talk about as other lists come around. So those are probably the unique ones, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine.
Cool. So, where's Stephen's list? Okay. Okay, so he's got, I'll do 6 to 10. And then you can do the other one, Dan. So he's gone more organisation. So he's gone witch doctors, specifically someone like Hugin. Then he's got Kurt, which is the Phantom's brother in Defenders of the Earth TV series. Then the Lady Luck Pirates, the Nomad, and then Lubunga at number 6. I like the fact that he's done the Phantom's brother in Defenders of the Earth. Like, for me, that's the best episode, the brother versus brother on the Defenders of the Earth. So I'm really glad he included that one. And we talked about it during the start of the podcast when we said that that we've got a future villain as well, so it's a good addition. The Witch Doctors is an interesting one. And then you've got Lubunga and Nomad. Any comments to those guys?
I like a good Witch Doctors. Oh, sorry, Pat.
No, you go ahead.
I do like a good Witch Doctors story. They're probably getting harder to write in 2020 and beyond. That requires a lot of thought about how you handle a villain like that. But I have enjoyed a lot of Witch Doctor stories in the past.
Yeah, that was you basically said what I was going to say. So no need to comment further for me.
Fair enough. And the Ladylike Pirates was an interesting choice. Did any of you have that in your top tens?
No, I considered them because, for reasons I'll explain when I talk about the Sky Band, I think.
Okay. All right. Okay. And Lubunga. I think Lubunga might feature in everyone's top 10. Maybe. So it'll be interesting if that is the case. Dan, do you want to go your 10 to 6, mate?
Yes, I will. And so I have gone Labunga in my 10 to 6 because certainly a really challenging villain for the fandom to overcome. Anyway, so in reverse order, at number 10, I've got Drummer of Timpani, who's probably appeared in the fewest stories of anyone on the list, I think, now. I just really like the Drummer of Timpani as a character. I mentioned Witch Doctors just now. He probably does fit into that category, and just someone who could come up with a rhythm on a drum that was so hypnotic that he could take over tribes. I just love that. And the challenge the fandom has to overcome it. And as I said, multiple stories. Number 9, I've probably cheated a little bit and put 2 organisations because I think that if Lee Ford could only come up with either Scorpia or Hydra, both of which I've sort of settled on at number 9, I'd love a really organised international criminal gang, which Scorpia and Hydra both are. So I feel like you could probably, I'm cheating, I know, but I couldn't pick one of them and not the other one there. I think there's a lot of potential for future stories there.
Are they underutilised? Should we see more stories of Scorpia and Hydra?
Well, as I said, a lot of my thoughts were about stories that could come about these, because again, both of those criminal organisations go back. They're not brand new. You could write stories for them where the 18th fandom was fighting against a version of them. So there's a lot of potential for Scorpia and Hydra.
Yeah.
Labunga was at 8.
Yeah, sorry. I just was going to say quickly, I remember when I interviewed Klaus Raymerty for the Chronicle Chamber page back in the day, he actually mentioned the Scorpion and Hydra as being, he didn't find them very appealing villains because they didn't have they were just not as interesting to him like the Vultures and those kinds of bad guys. He didn't find them to have any interesting sides to them, basically.
Yeah, fair enough. They probably do lend themselves to the Phantom being more of a detective character than a rough and tumble character, I guess. But I'm sure they'll still find a way to give someone a skull mark on the way through.
Yes, of course.
Number 8, I've got Lubunga, who, on reflection, and this is not intentional, but is probably my only Scandinavian creation on my top 10. So I recognise what a difficult and painful villain Lubunga was right throughout. Really, really, and in a similar vein, I guess I've got number 7 is Chatu the Python, who you mentioned, Paul, and then at number 6 is the Sky Band, who I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with what you said, Paul, about what Clace said about Scorpion and Hydra. The one they're underutilised, and I don't really think Falk probably we never really got to see their real. They kind of seemed like what am I trying to say? Some organisation like the Singh Brotherhood, they were terrifying. They were pirates. They had that unique element to it. The Vultures is another one with the big V on their forehead, where Scorpion and Hydra kind of more like seemed just like a mob, like just like an organisation, and they didn't really have that X factor or that scary bit, and it kind of. Maybe it was because they work so well in the shadows that they don't kind of come across as, but I think they were probably underutilized as a villain by Lee Falk, and I would like to see more Phantom creators using those guys. I really enjoyed what Shane Foley did with Scorpius, and I really think that those two villains could be used a lot better.
I certainly take your point about the lack of a point of difference, I guess, and that's why I've lumped them in together. But it's also why they're as low as they're still in the top 10, but they're in 9th spot for me. Like there's certainly others that are above them.
Cool.
Did you have the Skyband in your top 10, Germ, or am I the only one? Am I one out on that?
No, I didn't. I don't really like that story.
Now, there's two stories, Skyband and Return of the Skyband.
I didn't really like either of them. In the first one, in the original Skyband, the Phantom doesn't do anything. He sits in jail moping and talking to a Mickey Mouse. And then he doesn't even really do anything to save the day. So that story is not very memorable to me. Like, the mouse does more to save the day than what the Phantom does in that story. So I like the concept. It's definitely, I can understand why it's in people's top 10s with it, because it was also featured in the movie. Defenders of the Earth have done a Skyband. Moonstone has done a Skyband. So I understand its appeal. But I just, it doesn't really appeal to me personally.
Fair enough. No, well, I guess it's as similar as it's an organised gang. So there's nothing scary and particularly vicious about it. The point of difference is that it's an all-female gang, which I think, again, for 1936 is way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
For when it was written. So
they were using airplanes and they were ruthless as well. Like they weren't using their charm or something, but they were very ruthless.
That's it.
So it's like I said, I see why it would be in people's top 10s. If we're talking about girl gangs, I prefer the Golden Circle over the Skyband. It's just probably not my favourite.
Fair enough. And I guess that's Steve landed on Lady Luck as his favourite female gang.
And I've got a female gang in my top 15, and you've got one.
Is that Golden Circle?
The Golden Circle, yeah.
Yep.
You've got one. Stephen's got one. So I think the all-female gang is a concept that resonates with a lot of fans.
Teenage boys, when they read it, we all just like different artwork.
Yes, probably reading it as a teenage boy probably had a lot to do with it. So what about you, Paul? What would be your favourite all-girl gang?
I'm sorry to disappoint you, Jermayn, but I love the original Skyband stories by Falk. So I would pick them. I also really, it's one of the best Moonstone stories that shows their modern day return, basically, with the daughter of Salah, who thinks she is the daughter of Kit Walker.
Yeah.
So I would have, that would probably have influenced me picking them as my favorite too, because they were updated for today and really well impacted.
Yeah, the artwork was enjoyable. The story was good, and the front covers by Doug Kaluba was probably some of my favourites that he's done as well.
Yes, the second one shows the Phantom falling through the sky, fighting with, but it doesn't actually happen in the story. I remember being disappointed by that.
Yeah, but no, they were great covers.
Yeah, and also I always also wonder. This is like a sidetrack, but I always wondered if James Bond was in the news again because Sean Connery died the day before we started recording this. And I was always been wondering if the in the book and the film Goldfinger there is this band of basically female air pirates. I always wondered if Ian Fleming, the James Bond creator, got the idea from Lee Falk. Maybe it's just speculation.
That's a good point.
I think we can assume safely that he did.
Let's just
maybe.
We're a Phantom podcast, so we'll claim it.
Yeah, we'll do.
So what was your 10 to 6, Jerm?
Okay, my 10 to 6 was the Vultures. Now, I've put them ahead of the other organisations like Hydra and Scorpio and stuff because of the point of difference. Like, for me, it's the big V and the fact that they're so despicable. You know, they prey on the weak. They go through walls and knock off all the people that are rich, for, you know, to steal from the people. The story that Peter Anderson wrote, Requiem, you know, that was quite horrible to read. The original story with art by Jamie Val, where they took over, I think it's the Vultures of Vakul, I think the story was. You know, they're despicable human beings, and the fact that they've been, you know, like many past Phantoms have battled the Vultures as well. So for me, the fact that they've got that point of difference and they are so despicable sees why I'm in the top 10. Chandra Singh as 9. One of the things I like about her is that she's a different type of villain. A lot of villains that the Phantom fights, they're kind of like them. You know, they're the brawn versus brawn. You know, muscle versus muscle, fist fights where the Phantom can't do that to Chandra Singh. And then there's that tension, you know, and sometimes the Phantom's not sure if Sandal's a good person or a bad person. The fact that we're going to, you know, if you look at the 22nd Phantom, you've got 2 generations fighting Chandra Singh. So you've got Kit and Heloise and the 21st Phantom fighting Sandal. There's not many bad guys where 2 generations fight the same person. So that appeals to me. And I also like the fact that the Phantom's doesn't quite know how to deal with her and stuff. So that's why she's number 9. Number 8, Princess Sin. You know, looking forward to the new story, the new trade paperback and the board game that's coming out with that. So I think, and I really enjoyed the stories. And I've enjoyed Dale McCanty's take on her in the prequel story. And then I'm looking forward to the sequel story with her as well. So she gets into my top 10. The Black Carnation is in number 7. Do you guys remember him?
Yes,
Vaguely.
very well.
Yeah.
I think he was. We were referring to lifespans of villains earlier, and he. Spoiler again, he died a few years ago, but he was used. I think basically the perfect amount of times because you didn't. Not enough to be tired of him, but he died just in time before that happened. He was an interesting villain.
Yeah, he was an interesting villain. One of the things that sticks with me was when he chained the Phantom up on the Skull Throne.
Yeah.
As someone who was, I think I was a fan 5-10 years when that story came out. so I was quite impressionable at that time. The fact that the Phantom was chained up in his own skull cave, in his own skull throne, kind of was like, oh, wow, this guy's to be taken serious. He impersonated the Phantom for a period of time. And then even at the beginning of the stories that we saw with him, he was kind of like someone he was a master of disguise, and so he would help people escape and stuff, and then he would leave a calling card. So he had that point of difference, and he captured my imagination, and he had the brains, but he also was able to, I guess, trouble the Phantom as well. So he was a likeable villain in a sense. And number 6, I had Rama Singh. Now, I included Rama Singh. I made mention before about the fact that I've included in my top 15 villains that have killed past Phantoms. He killed the Phantom's father, our Phantom's father, the 20th Phantom. And I really enjoyed the Double Rainbow story, and which was being made into, Lee Falk's newspaper story, a Bill Lignanti story, Egmont story, and then we've kind of got that story also in the movie as well. So, a Singh pirate betraying, the Phantom and all that kind of, in my opinion, kind of captured me as well, and is memorable.
And it's quite brutal the way he kills. It's not depicted graphically or anything, but it really got my imagination going as a kid reading it, because I think you see in both the original Wilson McCoy drawn version and also the one it was remade by Kari Leppanen. You see basically him ready to put the knife into the 20th Phantom, and that was quite shocking to me when I was a kid reading it.
I distinctly remember the holding up the belt with the hole through it, and just the idea of that's where the belt. You see the stabbing motion, where it's gone in, and you don't need to see the actual moment to get a full grip of how nasty it is to be stabbed in the back.
Yeah. And I think the fact that he tricked the 20th Phantom as well, and let's face it, he's a lowlife, and he has become who he is through stabbing in the back, scratching, clawing. He's that kind of despicable bad guy. You get your flamboyant bad guys like the Black Carnation, or even like Princess Sin, or the Cyband and stuff like that, where Rama Singh is kind of like on the other end. He's that real despicable, unlikable villain.
I also like the fact that the Phantom. I also like the fact that the Phantom seems to believe in second chances, basically by trusting him, because he might appear a little naive doing it, but it kind of shows that the Phantom has such a good heart that he is willing to trust the possibility of this pirate having changed his ways. And then, of course, he gets punished for that. So.
Well, this is where I'm very glad that I've cheated. You've labelled 2 different Singhs in your 10 to 6, Germ, and I've got them all wrapped up in one nice little bow under Singh Brotherhood in my top 5. So,
yeah, fair enough. All right, so that's our 10 to 6. I will admit, I'm a little bit surprised you and Stephen has Lubunga not in your top 5. So that's kind of interesting.
I've got a Lubunga representative in my top 5, and that's partly how I ordered. Then is because and spoilers, General Babu is in my top 5, and I see he and Chatu as being. He and Lubunga as being very similar characters. So I couldn't justify both of them, and in the top 5, that was the ordering.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyone else got any? I like the fact that there's some different villains in our second part of top 10 that, that, like, for instance, I've got the Black Carnation, Princess Sin, Paul's got Irma and Carmel and Goldhan, and then when you've kind of, and then Steve's got, Kurt and stuff like that. So I like how there's some characters that are some unique villains in our second half of the top 10.
Yeah. And I've gone probably a very traditional, because as I said, Lubunga is my only Scandinavian creation in my top 10. The rest are American creations because they're all either Lee Falk or Tony DePaul. And so they're I probably represent the traditionalists. Surprise, surprise. In my top 10 villains list.
Yeah. So what I find hard about Lee Falk's villains is that majority of them have only ever been created once.
I don't have a single one, as I said, that only has ever been in one story.
Yeah, so that's probably the part that I found the hardest, including Lee Falk villains, was that he only created them. He did one story and then he moved on. And then some of the ones where he did go on and have multiple stories, like General Bababu, I don't have in my top 10. I don't even have General Bababu in my top 15.
There you go. And yet, you had Vultures in 10th place, and they were in a single Lee Falk story before Tim Fadiman took them up.
Yeah, and then Tim Fadiman have got them in about 5-10 following stories. So, yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, should we go on to our top fives?
Well, I think we should. We're over an hour into the podcast.
Okay, so we'll do it in reverse order. So my top five, I have Baron Grover as my number 5. Now, he was from The Seahorse. Now, he's also been in a Fratelli Sparta story, which we actually reviewed a couple of months ago in a Giant Size story. He, in my opinion, he's the most despicable bad guy that Lee Falk's created. He's kind of like a Rama Singh, where he's a despicable human being. He kills for fun. He's just not likable. Like, there's been some bad guys that Lee Falk's created, and you almost like them, but you don't like Baron Grover. And so that's, and I just love that whole story with the whole cat and mouse between Baron and the Phantom, where they had to do the fight with Big Steve, and then he got hunted along the island and all that. It's a memorable story for me. Number 4, I've got...
Hang on, before you go on, Paul, you had Baron Grover in your original list. Did he make your top 5?
No, he didn't this time. I'm not really sure why. He would probably be in my top 15 still, but he didn't make it this time.
I didn't have him in my top 10 either, but I think that what he I talked about Babu and Lubunga being similar characters before. I think Baron Grover is absolutely the worst of the characters who were wealthy and were going to hook up with Diana and then turned out to be treacherous and run a gang. Like, there was a whole heap of those characters that Lee Falk invented. And I think you're right. Baron Grover was the worst of them. Yeah.
And I think that's why I chose him. It was because he was the worst of them. Number 4, I've got the Nomad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will admit, I kind of had trouble putting him and Chatu the Python, where to put them. Now, I've got the Nomad after Chatu purely because the 21st Phantom, he battled him and he fought against him, but he never really kind of met him and fought him close up. It was more of like a battle, a distance battle, if you know what I mean. Like, You know, like when they first met, it was they were going through the jungle, and then they were hunting for the Phantom, and the Phantom was dressed up as Kit Walker, giving it as a guide to try and find the Phantom, and then he went and stormed his fortress out in the desert, but they never really met. And then even when the Phantom, or when Nomad got captured, it wasn't the Phantom that captured him, it was his daughter that kind of captured him. So I think that's the reason why I've kind of separated him and put him lower than Chatu, was purely because they were fighting kind of separately and a distance. But in saying that, as I said in the last podcast, I think the Nomad has more reach because and more potential for further stories with the Nomad's wife and the daughter and stuff like that as well. So I think there's more potential with the Nomad, but he's not as high as Chatu. For number 3, I had Dogai Singh. Now, I know I did say before that he got long in the tooth, but he was a horrible Singh pirate. And then one of the things I really enjoyed was, I'm not sure if you remember him, the story about Dogai before he became the leader of the Singh Brotherhood. I really enjoyed those stories, kind of learning and seeing the evolution of Dogai from who he was to who he then became. And I'm kind of glad they put him on ice because I think he did get a bit long on the tooth. And I think that's the reason why I had him at 3, because I originally had him at number 2. Number 2, I had Chatu, the Python. Now, the reason I had him at number 2 is because him and number 1, which is Lubunga, they were the two that have given, in my opinion, the 21st Phantom the most grief. Chatu made the Phantom believe that his wife had died. And we saw it in the newspaper stories where he was a mess. The 21st Phantom was a mess. He was probably not fit to continue as the Phantom. And he really defeated him. And not only that, the first time they met, he also defeated the Phantom. He almost killed him by blowing him up with the suicide bomber. And apart from Lubunga, I don't think any Phantom has had someone who has challenged him as much mentally to be able to out-trick him. And he did this while he was in jail, but also he physically met him and he physically was able to defeat the Phantom as well. So that's the reason why I've got those two as the top 2. And Lubunga, well, Lubunga took away the Phantom's friend. He's probably his best friend or second best friend behind Guran in Luaga. And that, as a new fan, I love that series. To this day, I still love the series of Lubunga versus Luaga versus the Phantom. So that's my top 5.
Fair enough. And excellent justifications of all of them. You've probably got me rethinking Chatu a little bit because where did I put him? 7, maybe he could come up. But I think it's interesting that, and I did listen to the last podcast, that last time you argued Nomad versus Chatu, you said if you had to get rid of one, you'd get rid of Chatu. But now you're arguing that he's the second best villain of all time. Yeah,
and I think the reason for that is because I think the Nomad has more potential and future for future stories. Where I think Chatu has probably run his race. And you know how we've talked about in the part at the beginning of this podcast that sometimes you have to end a villain. And I think Chatu's has been ended. And then I think it's the Nomad. And I think with the Nomad's wife, I think she has the potential to become a real thorn in the side for Heloise and stuff like that, which is the next generation Phantom. So and then Diana, of course, playing matchmaker with trying to marry his son off to a terrorist's daughter.
What do you reckon, Paul?
I think Chatu was on number 8 on my list, and I didn't have the Nomad. He would have been on my top 15. But I think, like Jermayn says, I think Chatu has run his course by now. I don't think I would prefer if he didn't show up again anytime soon. But he was in the Death of Diana storyline. I remember he was such a great character. He was and that was easily. I think that's one of the best Phantom stories of all time, and it was so. Yeah. It was so exciting to follow day by day to see in what ways he would. You always felt that the Phantom. You always feel that the Phantom will win in the end, but in that storyline, I wasn't really so sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably I had that experience with Reckoning of the Nomad most recently, and I hear what Jermayn said about it wasn't technically the Phantom who captured him because Heloise at that stage hadn't sworn the oath and got the ring, but she's got the blood of the Phantom in her, and as far as I'm concerned, the Phantom as a concept, which is all what he trades off of, has defeated the Nomad in that instance. But I agree, I think there's more to come, and that's part of what excites me and why I've the other way around. I've got the Nomad higher than Chatu.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Dan, you want to give us your top 5?
Righto. So my top 5, this might be a little bit left field in 5th spot, but I really love the Mountain Princes as a group. And we know that the Misty Mountains is part of Bengala, and particularly through the Wilson McCoy era, I would have to say, the Mountain Princes were a real thorn in the side of the Phantom. I love the concept that you've got all of these little principalities. Again, I know this is cheating because I'm lumping them all in together, but rather than pick one as a representative of them all, I just said a Mountain Prince. I loved those stories where you've got these little principalities that are stuck in the 1800s or the 1500s or the 1200s or whatever era that Mad Prince was a fan of. I love the idea of the Phantom going in and creating legends. Lots of old jungle sayings came from interactions with the Misty Mountain Princes as well. I think they're just really fun stories because you could go in, knock over a principality, turn him over to the commoners, and set the place on the course to democracy, and then go back to the deep woods, rescuing Diana on the way because she's probably been caught up as the 50th wife of one of them or something. So. I know they're not villainous in that sense, but I just think they're a fun character for the Phantom to be battling against.
Do you have a favourite Mountain Prince?
Oh, yeah, and I'll get the names all wrong, but the one who took Diana as her 50th wife, the one where Phantom knocked the top off the turret she was in. I think that's probably the same story. So I guess that would be my favourite one, without being able to draw the name to mind. But even there's so many opportunities for those stories today still. You could have some fun with it, but you could also take it seriously and treat them like a dictatorship if you liked too. So.
Well, Shane Foley's done that with his Scorpius story at the end of in one of the many pre-leagues and prologues and stuff like that. There's Tagon, I believe, is one. Prince Orc is another who feature at the end of the story. So I think Shane Foley will probably be agreeing with you right at this stage.
There you go.
If I had to say, my favourite would be Samaras, who was one of the Mountain Princesses, and then Carlo the Cheap, who did the hijackers, who did the airplane hijackers. And then he would buy stuff because it was cheap. So, for instance, like he brought his wife because she was missing a couple of teeth, or he brought a flawed diamond and stuff like that. It was just silly. But
and I guess that's part of why I've included them, because as I said, they're fun. And you can do anything with them as an author. Whatever madcap idea, for a tyrant or a bad guy. Oh, let's make it a different principality in the Misty Mountains, and you can get away with it.
Yeah. Paul, do you have a favourite mountain prince or princess?
No, I have to admit those kinds of stories are usually not my favorite phantoms. They kind of blend together for me. There isn't anyone that stands out except Samaris, as you mentioned, which is a great story. But other than that, they kind of seemed like I kind of feel like Falk was repeating himself sometimes when he wrote those tales. I'm sorry, Dan, but
No, you're absolutely right. They were such good stories. He kept going back to the well, mate. So
yeah. That's the real reason.
And I'm probably the same because I couldn't remember the specifics of one, but I just love them they're memorable as a group of stories that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Fourth for me was General Babu. As I said before, he was sort of I guess he was Lee Falk's Lubunga. He came about 20 years before Lubunga, started to appear in the 1970s and was quite nasty in the 80s in particular. Cy Barry stories, so really well drawn. Probably I read them first and I really enjoyed them above Lubunga. It was an example of someone, well, I guess Lubunga was just Babu on steroids in the end, wasn't he? Because he actually achieved everything that Babu set out to do. Babu probably came back one or two times too many in the end because they all started to come a little bit, okay, he's off sulking in another kingdom and now he's going to try and get the funds together to come back and whatever. So, but as someone who was genuinely scary, and I guess part of that's the imagery that Cy Barry drew with all of the tanks and the weapons that he brought and the armory that he was going to need to take over the government and get rid of the Phantom. He always struck fear into me as a reader at the time. So,
yeah.
Number 3 is the Singh Brotherhood for me, and this is I include Dogai and Sandal and Rama and Kabai Singh from the very first one, all in this, and so in a sense they probably should be number 1. But I guess the difference between my 3, 2, and 1 is I think the Singh Brotherhood has had a good run, and my characters in 2 and 1 I think I'd like to see more of a run. So straight up, I guess I've got the Nomad in number 2 and the Vultures in number 1, who I know you had in at 10th, Germ. And when you were describing why you had the Vultures in 10, I thought, well, those are all of the reasons why I have them in number 1. So Singh Brotherhood, as I said, long history with the Phantom, lots of different characters. I love the idea of different Phantoms battling different generations of Singh Brotherhood. So they've got that opportunity. Probably, well, they're pirates. They go back all of the generations. They were the reason why the Phantom was created. The Singh Brotherhoods killed the father of the first Phantom. So they probably really should be first when you a lot of people would have them as first. I guess not many people wouldn't have them in their top 5 or sprinkled through their top 10, as I know you guys have done. The Nomad, you made an interesting point before, Jerm, about them never actually meeting and facing off. And I guess that's where the payoff hopefully is coming. I talked before about writers playing a long game, and we all know that Tony DePaul can write an excellent long game, and he's doing that well with the Nomad at the moment, I think. Death of Diana Palmer was another one of his that the sagas that was, absolutely gripping. So I'm really looking forward to and I'd like the way that the Nomad is an opponent that the Phantom has to match wits with, and resources, and brawn, albeit through the Nomad's minions so far regarding the brawn. But he's a triple threat, the Nomad, in that sense. And then Vultures are just Vultures. You've said the word despicable a couple of times. They would be the most despicable villain that I can think of. Picking over war scenes and robbing the dead and the wounded and not caring which side they're on, but just sucking off both sides. I think the Vultures are the worst Phantom villain of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's probably the reason why I didn't rate them as high was probably because they haven't appeared as many times as some of the others, and I think they're almost a lost. They're almost a lost opportunity. Like there needs to be more of the Vultures, and I was really excited at the end of the second part of the 22nd Phantom Saga when it was the Vultures that were behind. So that got me really excited, because it was like, yeah, maybe finally we're going to see the Vultures actually be, a part where justified, they're a great villain.
And I think that Peter Anderson and Wendell Cavalcanti's story, Requiem, probably really emphasised that and probably leapt them to the top of the list for me, because in that story they were particularly horrific. Yeah.
Have you read that story, Paul?
I'm trying to remember now, but if I have, it escapes my memory, so I can't really comment on it.
It was in the.
But I do.
It was in the Frew annual war special from last year, I think.
Oh yes. Oh yes, the one from World War One.
Yes.
Yes, of course, that was terrific. That was a great story. I remember. Yeah. Yes, I remember it. I think the Vultures are great villains. I didn't, like I said, I only thought about having individual characters on my list, but I think as a concept they are really unique. And I don't know any other type of villains who have that kind of preying on the poor and preying on war and famine and everything like that. But I also one thing that none of you pointed out is kind of the absurdity of their giant V tattoos on their foreheads, which kind of makes it makes no sense, of course, because they are a secret organization who kind of brand themselves like that. But I still love that whole gimmick because it looks so cool.
Yeah.
And I guess that's
you're
what
right.
it is.
Secret organization. We got a face tattoo, basically.
Yes.
I think that's what makes them so memorable is the V.
Yeah, it's very striking.
Yeah, for me that helps, and it helps with the point of difference, the stuff. So yeah, it's a ludicrous idea, but I think in the world of comics it works brilliantly.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So Steve's top 5, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, did you want me to read them out?
Yep.
All right. So Steve had his top 5. General Babu, and I'm not going to dwell on that because hang on, it's just appeared. So Steve had as 5th. He also had the Mountain Princes, so we absolutely tied there, Steve. I'm sure he'd agree with everything I said before. General Babu in 4th, which is where I had him too, isn't it? Yep. No, Steve and I are on our wavelength. The Butterfly Man in 3rd.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Cool. Butterfly Man.
Yeah.
He's finished his top 2 with Singh Brotherhood and Vultures, who we've already talked about. But the Butterfly Man.
I remember him loving the story when we reviewed that story. 2 years ago?
Yeah.
He's and he's made notes that he would like to like a prequel. I think that's I agree with him that I think we could quite easily, because we saw the end of the Butterfly Man, we could quite easily see a prequel or a series of prequels kind of the character becoming the Butterfly Man and stuff like that. So, and I think that's the thing that I like about all of our top 10 so far is there's that one or two characters that are kind of like, oh yeah, he's a good villain, or which is kind of memorable. So I like that one, Steve. Good choice.
And should note, now that I'm actually reading the notes as well, that Steve does say that other than Vultures in first place, which he's firm on, the rest are in no particular order. So, worth noting that as well.
Oh, we'll just pretend he did his job and gave us the top 10. Paul, do you want to give us your 5 to 1?
Yes, I'll be happy to. On number 5, I have Bale from the Mystery of the Golden Rune series, a 5-part story from It was originally published in Norway and Sweden in 1989, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
He's this clearly supernatural character who haunts different phantoms throughout the different centuries. And his ultimate goal is to, it's been many years since I read it now, but it's a fantastic story. And his ultimate goal is basically to open the gates to hell, if I remember correctly. Which was, it's such a cool concept and really stands out among other phantom villains. And in the end of his, in the finale of his last story, you basically see him, as he perishes, he basically seems to turn into some kind of demon or something, which was, I remember reading it for the first time as like a 10-year-old. It just blew my mind right off. Have you read the story, both of you?
Yes.
It was recently published again by Frew maybe 3 years ago.
Oh, right, yeah.
I believe. I'm just going to quickly do 2015, so 5 years ago. 1726 and onwards. So it was recently published again 5 years ago. I'm not sure if that's recently, but so it's an enjoyable series. I think, and I won't speak for Dan, but I'm sure he'll agree with me. Probably the supernatural element wasn't as enjoyable for us.
All right.
It was in saying that he was a formidable villain, and he fought against multiple generations of the Phantom as well.
Yes, and he is the kind of character who would. I'm not sure if it would be possible to do kind of. He's dead now in the comic, but I would love to see him return in some way, because who knows? Maybe he found a way of haunting other phantoms that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I'm with Jerm. I probably never entertained the idea of a supernatural villain in my top 10 or 20 or considerations at any time, because it's just not. The supernatural stories are not ones that appeal to me at all. And actually interesting, it might be interesting, Paul, because I've speculated in the past on the podcast that it's probably a little bit to do with the culture of our countries. Like Australia, certainly white Australia, has only got a very secular culture going back 200 and something years, whereas your part of the world has got a history that goes back further than we can probably comprehend. And has a lot of mythological lore as part of that as well. So it might be something that, Norway, Sweden, Scandinavia is more accepting of, I guess.
Yeah, maybe. But I've also noticed that in modern media and other modern forms of entertainment, supernatural stories seem to be more popular than ever, basically. So I think maybe the Phantom comics of from Simic and Egmont were a little before their time in many ways, because now you have so many of the biggest TV shows and films today are. Before they used to be like more thrillers, and crime fiction used to be maybe the most popular, but now you have stuff like Game of Thrones and all that kind of stuff really taking over the world, basically. So I think it might be, maybe it's a bit of a cultural thing, but it seems to conquer the world more and more, basically.
Yeah, good point.
And I also thought that I never had a problem with supernatural in the Phantom. It always caught my imagination a great deal. As long as it's not overused, I'm happy to see supernatural elements. I sometimes think that it makes the Phantom himself a little less special, maybe, that there are demons and vampires and werewolves in his world. When he actually pretends to be a ghost, you could argue that it makes him a little less special, maybe. And he's kind of he's tricking people into thinking he is supernatural. But if there are real supernatural things going on in his universe, then maybe he maybe he's a little redundant, you could argue. But I still love seeing those elements. And I recently read the Lee Falk story about the gladiator again, if you remember that one.
Yeah.
Where he, I don't think Falk ever. He always hints at the supernatural, but it's always kind of vague if it's a dream or whatever.
Yeah.
Which is another good way of doing it, obviously.
Yeah. No, it's. I enjoy getting your thoughts on it, because we've speculated it a few times on the podcast, and I guess you're kind of representing the Scandinavian readers at this stage, Paul.
Yeah.
So it's interesting hearing your thoughts on it.
Oh, that's good. Should I go on with my list?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes. On number 4, I had I mentioned the villain Manuel Ortega earlier, or I didn't mention him by name, but I felt I had to include him because he's the one villain who seems to kill me in the Moonstone comic I was in. So it would be a shame to not honor him for doing that. Well, basically, he was created by Mike Bullock, who wrote the Moonstone stories for the last few years. They were during the Phantom, and he first appeared in I think the story is called Tiger's Blood or something.
Yeah.
Where basically you see that he has a good reason for hating the Phantom, because he thinks the Phantom caused the death of his wife. That is not true, of course, but he has a very clear motivation for haunting the Phantom. And he also, like I said, I also love gimmicks, and he ends up having one of the coolest ones, because his face gets badly burnt in his first story. So it looks like, he basically paints his disfigured face to look like a skull, which I thought was really cool. And also he is one of the rare villains who is a physical presence that can match the Phantom.
Yeah.
He actually loses fights to him, and he doesn't. One of you mentioned earlier that the Phantom maybe has a tendency to win over bad guys a little too easily sometimes. It's usually one punch and then it's over. But with this guy, he certainly had tougher fights, and it wasn't so clear every time if he would actually win.
Yeah, no, Manuel's a good inclusion. I remember talking to Mike Bullock about him on our podcast recently. I think you make a brilliant point where he blames the Phantom for the death of his wife or fiancée or whatever, and it's a good point where it's probably the first time I've actually ever read a story where someone is a villain of the Phantom because of a side effect or of what he has done. It reminds me of what was it, the Batman versus Superman movie, where that dude died who was friends of Batman, and so that's why he hated Superman and why they went to war against each other, because of Superman's what would you call it, of the reaction or the side effect of him battling, which is, so it's it's a brilliant concept by Mike Bullock, and he's a very underrated writer, and I think that's the first time we've probably seen a villain caused by a side effect of the Phantom, like a butterfly effect, a sliding doors moment, whatever you want to call it. So I like that choice.
Yeah, me too. And it's interesting you mentioned the butterfly effect, because the Phantom's actions would really have repercussions if we don't really see them in the comic most of the time. But of course something like that would happen if you had like a vigilante running around doing the things he does. So I think it's a cool concept. And it's also it's also a little less black and white maybe than that because I mean he probably has his reason for hating the Phantom is kind of justified, but
Yeah.
of course of course he's a heartless killer, so his methods are really despicable, but you kind of understand him from a certain point.
Yeah.
So I'm going to proceed. At number 3, I had Dogai Singh.
Mhm.
You guys have said a lot about him already, but one of the things I was going to point out is that when he was first introduced in the Phantomen comics, he was, I think for several years, maybe, if I remember correctly, he was more like a shadowy presence. You didn't even see his face until several stories into his creation. And then when you see him in his first story, which is in Norwegian, it was called The White Rider by Dai Darrell and Hans Lindahl, I think.
Yeah.
He is actually that is actually his that's the first encounter he has with the Phantom face to face. It's not his first story, but the first time they actually meet. And in that story, he's terrifying because he is like there's nothing supernatural about him, but he's almost like some kind of demon who just takes the Phantom completely by surprise. And is also interestingly enough, he's also shown being physically able to take on the Phantom in that story.
Yeah.
They never really followed up on that in later stories, but in that one, the Phantom nearly gets killed by him, and is, if I remember correctly, he's basically saved at the last minute by some chance accident or something.
Yeah.
So I don't think he was ever scarier than he was in that story, but in later tales, he became kind of more like this cunning, scheming villain who I don't think he ever fought the Phantom again in that way. I don't remember.
I think you might be right, because when I think of Dogai Singh, that's what I remember as well. I remember that type of villain. I remember him being a scheming one, but I also remember him being the physical presence who almost defeated the Phantom, who caused the Phantom lots of troubles, and then it was kind of in the last 5-10 years he almost becomes a joke. So and the first story I ever read of Dogai Singh was I think it was The Curse of the Singh Brotherhood. It was issue 1128 or something like that, where he faked his death to expose some traitors, and he just killed him on the spot when he found out who it was, and he was a villain, and it was kind of like, oh my gosh, who's this? You know, it was the first time I ever met him, and then the last 5 years he just becomes a joke, and so I like him, you know, for the first 20 years we saw of him.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that, but I also think that because he was dead for like, I don't remember how many years, but then they resurrected him, and I think they managed to find some new use for him. Basically, him being resurrected led to some really exciting stories, like the one you mentioned earlier about his origins, him growing up into becoming the villain that he is, and also the ongoing saga about the Phantom's possible extra son, where he plays a pretty important part, of course. So I'm glad I brought him back. I prefer villains to stay dead, but with both Dogai and Lubanga, I think they have managed to they made good use of them even after having them return. So if it works creatively, it's okay with me.
Interesting point. I must admit, I didn't like the stories when Lubunga came back from the death, and he's come back twice from the death. I personally, I didn't mind the 22nd Phantom story, but the other one, I think it was actually where he rescued Luaga's son. He helped save Luaga's son, which was Lon. I didn't like those stories. I probably prefer him just to stay dead.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think with well, I can talk more about Lubanga later because he is on my list. So I'll go to number 2 first, because I have General Bababu on second place. Like you guys pointed out, he kind of I'm not sure if you said it, but he as folk kept overusing him, you could argue he became kind of a joke. But in his first appearance in the story called, if I remember correctly, The Mysterious Ambassador, he is such a great threat, not just to the Phantom, but to all of Bengala, basically. He manages to take control of the country for a while, and feels he feels much more real for some reason in that story than he became later on. Turned maybe, I think folk maybe turned him into more of a comical figure as the years went by. But in that first one, he is he's quite a scary presence, I think.
I think
and
that,
also you have yes, sorry.
So I think that with Babu, when he first came out, and probably similar to the Nomad now, like the authors are writing to the times, and they are the global threats that people are scared of at the time. So dictators taking over other countries, and what was going on, I guess, in Lebanon and Northern Africa and across the world. At that time in the 70s and 80s when he was being created. That was the genuinely scary thing. The Nomad leading an international cell of terrorists, in the 2010s. That's, their real life stories. So a lot of these villains have got their context as well in the time that they've been created.
That's a great point. I haven't thought about that really, but I think Bababu has been he's been kind of irrelevant for many years now, but they managed to find pretty good use for him again. In the you guys mentioned the stories about the 22nd Phantoms, where he takes over most of Mavitan or Morristown and he becomes more like some kind of mafia guy in those tales. So I think
that is one thing I do like about the 22nd Phantom stories is that this.
What was that? Jen saying he liked it.
No, it's something that I don't mind about. The premise is that all of these competing factions who have been competing for many years have all got a toehold, and now we're watching the battle between all of these gangs, and he's been reduced to a gang member or a gang leader. They're all trying to establish dominance in that the chaos that is the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one thing I was also going to mention about him is that in the Mysterious Ambassador story, which was Falk also wrote a really terrific novel based on it. That if you haven't read it, I recommend it because I think it's the best of the Avon novels that I have read. But there is this there's this really terrific scene in it where the Phantom, especially in the book, it's almost like a horror film kind of thing because the Phantom takes Bababu on a ride through the jungle, and it's such a scary sequence where he just he terrifies Bababu, and it all culminates in the Skull Cave where Bababu actually has to fight Lubanga physically, and it's just such a great story. I find myself reading it again and again, and his inclusion on the list is mostly based on this story alone. Not what he became later on. But there was also I was also going to mention that he appeared in the 1995, I believe, Marvel miniseries about the 22nd Phantom. Which I actually think is the best use of the character after that original story, because he is, for one, he is shown killing the 21st Phantom, which was the story. That story was reprinted in Norway in like year 2000 when I had read the Phantom for 1 year. So that made a huge impression on me. I remember, and well, it's a very underrated story where he is quite an opponent for the Phantom in it.
Now, I didn't include Bababu in my top 10. I haven't included him in my top 15. Now, for me, when I think of him, I can't think of him just as the mysterious ambassador story where you're right. That story alone, he would be in the top 5 of mine.
Yeah.
But when I think of Bababu, I think of all the crappy stories afterwards where he's nothing but a joke, where he's a bumbling idiot, he bumbles around, he couldn't organise, what's the saying? He couldn't organise a...
what is the saying, Jim?
Well, what is it like when you can't organise something and there's heaps of it around or something like that? I can't think of the saying at the moment, but he's useless. He's absolutely useless in all of the other stories that Lee Falk created with him. And so because of those useless stories, I can't have him in my top 15.
Yeah, right. I think that's a good point. And I always wondered why Falk did that to the character, because he might as well have, in most of those stories, he might as well have just introduced new characters to take that kind of part. I think
he was just it probably was a bit going to the well at that point, because it was, it was in the last 15, 20 years of writing stories, and there's people who would argue that he was tapped out altogether by then, and not much good came of the last 15 years, certainly. They certainly weren't his glory days in terms of writing.
No, I get that. I still enjoy most of those stories, by the way, but I agree with you.
So who's your number one, Paul?
Yeah, well, not surprisingly, I think my top 3 is the same as it was back in when I wrote the original article, because my number 1 is still Kigali Lubanga. You have already discussed him really well earlier here, but I didn't actually. What I was going to say about him was that I didn't actually read those stories until I had been a fan for many years. I didn't manage to collect all of the Lubanga saga until I think like the mid 2000s or something, because I had to get them by back issues and going to antiquaries and stuff. So I didn't read the entire saga of his presidency until quite late, but being able to read them all chronologically and without having to wait weeks and months between the issues, it was, I think that must have been the optimal way of reading that saga, because I think it's a high point in the character's history, and it really shows you how he struggles to keep facing Lubanga. He loses again and again and against him. Like you pointed out, he loses his one of his best friends because of Lubanga, at least temporarily. And it was a really dark period for the entire country of Bengala. That it was. It's exciting to keep returning to those stories, because it was. Everything seemed up in the air in that era. Anything could happen, and old connections that the Phantom had were suddenly not available for him. So he kind of had to rely more on himself, and all of that was because of Lubanga's work. And also I remember none of you pointed out his introduction in his first story, but that is such an amazing sequence, because you see him, it's almost like reading a movie basically, because you see him sitting in the jungle somewhere, or at least out in nature, and he has a witch doctor mask on, and he like turns to the camera almost, and looks directly on the reader, and that was both unique and scary, and kind of showed you right up that this was something else. This was a new kind of villain.
Yeah, I actually reread the election in Bengala Part 1 and Part 2 today. In preparation for the podcast, and you're right. it's kind of had two subplots going at the same time, and they were running parallel, downwards like that, and it ran over 2 or 3 pages, and there was lots of black. So you had like a TV presenter talking about what was happening with the election, and then you had Lubunga, getting back on the witch doctor mountain and causing fear in the jungle. And you're right, it was like a real you read it and it's like, wow, the fan was in trouble for that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting looking back at the top 10s. You and I both had Labunga at number 1, and Stephen and Dan both had the Vultures at number 1.
That's 2 camps, basically.
Yeah. I think everyone had Lubunga in their top 10. Everyone except you had the Vultures in their top 10.
Yeah.
And then I think we all had Chatu in our top 10 as well. No, Dan didn't.
Yes, I did.
Oh, no, sorry, Stephen didn't. So Stephen didn't have Chatu. He had the Nomad in, so so there's a couple of there's a fair few similarities, but to be honest, there's not that many similarities between the
we have managed to discuss about 30 to 35 villains in our respective top 10 discussions, I think, which is really cool. And for me, one of the big takeaways is probably something that Paul said earlier about the phantom villains having a natural shelf life, and for some that might only be 1 or 2 stories, some that might be a dozen. But I think we can agree that in terms of creating a rogues gallery of the phantom, you wouldn't want the same 1 or 2 characters to be appearing in every second and third story, because it would get tired. Makes you wonder how Batman and Joker managed to do it.
I actually listened to the podcast that, you referred to it earlier with that brilliant Australian artist who's was a Grange Wallace or something.
Yeah.
And he basically, I think one of his theories about the Phantoms, not being as successful as Batman or whatever, was that there isn't as much of a recurring gallery of villains. But I think, for my personal preference, I think that's one of the reasons why I never tire of the Phantom, because there's all the stories the Phantom is so many things, because he appears through any time period, and he always, I think the fact that he always faces most of the time faces new people, it just keeps it fresh for me as a reader.
It's almost more believable.
Yeah, it is. So I think the Phantom is much more effective than Batman, because he usually wins in the end. Batman always.
And they can stay in jail.
And that's why we don't need to reboot the character and all the rest of it all the time, because oftentimes with your Supermans and your Batmans and all the rest of them, the holes they write themselves into such a corner that they go, right, let's throw it all out and start again. Which the Phantom never has had to do.
That's a great point, and I think that's a great point, because you can just keep going. I haven't thought about it in that way, but what I was going to say about I think Wallace, he thought the Phantom would have been more successful if he had more like a rogues gallery, and I think there might be some truth to that, because it's much easier to make toys and stuff like that, and get. I think Batman is probably so popular because he has people know the villains as well as the hero, and there was a Joker film last year that was really successful, I think, and so you kind of get more of it's probably easier to get into the eye of the public that way, but for me as a reader, I'm glad it is the way it is.
I think we would all buy a Vultures bubblehead doll, wouldn't we? Just
yeah, I would definitely. I think with if there was one villain I would have wanted to see more of, it would have been. I'm very interested to know what happens with the Nomad, but I think like we've been touching on, I think he's kind of nearing his lifespan too now. I think the last story he appeared in was so fantastic too that it will be hard to top. So I kind of hope we see the end of him soon.
Yeah, and I think that's where his wife and his daughter kind of make it a little bit interesting, is that their story, so the Nomad story might have finished, or he might have finished as a, but I don't think the wife or the daughter have yet. So,
and while they hang on, there's every chance he'll come back too. And it's not unrealistic, and it probably isn't pushing it too far to have him break out of jail once. Like obviously, we've said about Babu did that a number of times. Python has gone to jail. He's back in Wambezi prison now. So probably it's not beyond the realms to have him break out of prison once to get back involved in an ultimate battle.
Yeah, once is fine. 20 times, like the Joker, is probably a bit too much.
Stretching the friendship,
Yeah. So in looking at your original top 10, Paul, you had 5 that made it in your 2020 list and 5 that didn't. So the 5 that didn't was Rolf Mars, Baron Grover, Rama Singh, Sala, and the poor old Marshall sisters.
I think, like I said, I think I must have included the Marshall sisters as some kind of joke, but I really like those stories. And you also mentioned Ralph Mars, which was a character from the Marvel miniseries that I mentioned.
Yeah.
And he, I always thought it was a really cool character who was, as a kid at least, he made a huge impression on me because he nearly beats the Phantom too in a physical fight.
Yeah.
But he was kind of made redundant when I included Manuel Ortega, who is has some of the same, and also the Python, because they have some of the same qualities, but much more personality and are more detailed. They have been portrayed more detailed, basically.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. And then, so it's interesting, but Baron Grover, Rama Singh, those 2 were in my top 10.
So you're an influential writer, Paul, because your list got them into Germ's top 10.
Yeah, that's great. I have finally managed something in my life then.
If anything, I love listening to your top 10 and I guess seeing what changes 13 years down the track. I hate to think, that there'll be a podcast that we'll do and 13 years down the track and see what's changed from what we've said back in issue 10 or podcast 10 or something like that. So,
Just to do some maths then, Paul, you said earlier you were 31. This is 13 years ago. So you wrote this as an 18-year-old.
Yeah, I must have done. Yeah, that sounds right. That was probably the peak of my Phantom obsession in those years. I still love the character dearly, but I'm married with kids now, and I don't have anywhere near the time that I used to spend on it. But talking to you guys certainly reminds. Wow, what an experience actually getting to talk to people live about the Phantom. That's completely new to me.
Well, let's treat this as a shout out to any of our 18-year-old listeners that if you'd like to get involved and send us in articles and whatever, we'd be more than happy to publish.
That's an interesting challenge.
Definitely. So myself and Dan, we had an overflow list. So I think it would be amiss if we didn't at least mention them quickly. And then we'll probably wrap up the podcast. This has gone on for almost 2 hours now. So outside my top 10, I had Hydra. And then I had a couple that probably did, 2 that didn't make it into anyone's list. Chandra Skyhelm, who was actually the guy that killed the 14th Phantom.
He's got a universe card about him, number 10.
Yes, he does. He does have a universe card.
Controversially has a universe card about him, but no, I guess you like him.
Yeah, well, that's it. So I'm glad we got a universe card about him. I really enjoyed that story, and it was because of his death, or because of him killing the 14th Phantom, that we got the Unknown Commander. And so it kind of makes sense why he would be a top villain. Another one is I chose the ones with the worst names. Chutgan, spelled CH''Gaan. Now he was also battled the 14th Phantom, and he's also appeared in the 22nd Phantom series as well. Now he was a witch doctor, and I know I think it was you, Dan, that had the witch doctors.
Steve had witch doctors, but yeah.
So him and Hugin were probably my favourite witch doctors. So they come in at 13th and 14th, and then 15th was the Golden Circle. But yeah, I had to make mention of people that kind of, and I made mention of it at the start of the episode, of people that killed the Phantom or really, really pushed the Phantom, featured fairly highly in my list.
Well, my two that were honourable mentions, I guess, and I've got, they're listed as 11 and 12. They're fun villains that I remember, they're memorable stories. So General Tara he was from the Tyrant of Tarakimo stories. He featured in a couple when Diana was going into the United Nations, and she was going into Tarakimo to investigate war crimes and dictatorships and whatever. I just remember those stories as being fun. They were some of the earlier ones that I read. For the most part, Diana probably beats up on General Tara more than the others, and more than the Phantom does. And he's absolutely a buffoon, a sexist, racist buffoon who is shown up for what he is. And so it was just a fun, influential story for me when I was young. I enjoyed him. And the other one was Trader Joe, that I guess very much afoot in both camps, because in the modern stories he's very much a good guy. But I guess and he would be, as a character, regarded as a friend of the Phantom. But when he first appeared in, I think it might have even been Ray Moore, certainly Wilson McCoy, he was a rogue. He impersonated the Phantom at one stage, stole the Phantom's costume, and then even I seem to recall one of the more recently published old Semic stories, Trader Joe was, when they were talking about the politics of it, he was helping to skyrocket prices through his store and gouge the natives, financially. So anyway, I think there's a lot of potential to a character like that. So they were just ones that came to mind as I was putting my list together as fun ones.
Do you see Trader Joe as the bad guy and the good guy as the one character, or as two different characters?
Oh, I think you probably have to see him as two different characters, really, because you couldn't possibly conflate the two in together. But they just happen to have the same name, which is just one of the many quirks that Lee Falk bestowed upon us as fans now.
Yeah, definitely. But no, guys, I really enjoyed that exercise. Have any of you got any points or questions or things you want to raise before we sign off? Paul?
Well, only that this was really fun to do, and it really takes. Some of my choices are based on stories that many of them I haven't reread in years, but it's kind of I picked the villains who made huge impressions initially, and I haven't necessarily returned to do any research for my choices. So it was the ones that stood out initially. I ended up going with for the most case.
Me too. And I guess as a closer, I would say I think we've, if anything, we've come up with a really good premise for a feature article about the Phantom and the villains of the Phantom and shelf life and rogues gallery ideas and that sort of thing. So if only I ever had the time to sit down and write it, I think I'd probably enjoy that. But if someone else is inspired by this podcast and would like to, and if you're 18-year-old and you've got no wife and no family, and would like to spend some time writing a feature article on the Phantom and the villains, I'd love to read it.
Yeah, what I would love to be able to do, and I'll have to figure out a way of doing it, is combining the 4 of our top 10s and coming up with like an equation or something, and coming up with kind of like a Chronicle Chamber top 10 list based on our on you know, the 30, 40 names that we've come up with. So I might have to do it is, you know, what number 1 is worth 10 points, or, you know, and kind of work that way or something.
Well, you'll have to get Steve to put his in an actual order then.
Yeah, yeah. Steve will actually have to do his work. A huge shout out to Stephen. Yeah, no. So I think it might be interesting trying to combine them and coming up with a list based on our four of our top 10s. But Paul, I really enjoy chatting with you, catching up with you, and then getting you on this podcast. We've talked about it for a while. But yeah, no, it's been really great getting you on board. So, you know, a huge thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Here, Paul. It's been an absolute treat. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, thank you. Been very nice.
Awesome. So, yeah, we look forward to your next article so we can talk about it in another 13 years' time.
Yeah, we'll see if I find the time. Yeah, that's a challenge. Maybe a challenge possibly accepted. So.
Yeah. Now, do you have 1 or 2 kids? You got the 1?
I have 2 daughters, 2 and 5 years old. So it's a busy time for me.
Yeah,
but
same age as mine, basically. So yeah, nah.
Yeah, I remember that. But you know the drill. That whenever I enter my skull cave, as I call it, it's not as often as I would like, but it's when you have to prioritize your time so much, it just becomes it's like a holy experience almost. You just need to sit down here and soak in the Phantom comics. It's just wonderful.
Yeah. Sometimes you get so busy that my kids are actually the ones that spend more time in it than me. I come in there and they pull comics out and reading them, and I'm just like, oh, well, there could be worse things. But yeah, no, a huge shout out to everyone who listened to us. We hope you enjoyed tonight's podcast. Now, if you are on social media, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We will have on the article, which will have this YouTube video, we'll have each of our individual 4 lists, top 10, and it will, if I get time, it will have our combined top 10. On social media, we would love to be able to know what your top 10 is, or if you agree or disagree with some of the points that we've made. If you prefer to email us, you can do that by chroniclechamber@gmail.com. And of course, you can find this on chroniclechamber.com, which is our website. Now, if you listen to us via iTunes or Spotify or via other apps like Podbean, Player FM, Castbox, Listen Notes, or if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to us. Please give us a thumbs up or subscribe or give us a review or a 5-star rating, however they do it. That just helps other Phantom fans being able to find us, which is, helps keep us near the top for when people search Phantom. So greatly appreciated. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Dan, Paul, and Stephen, who was unable to join us. For myself, happy Phantoming, guys.
Happy Phantoming.
Happy Phantoming.
500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die. The Phantom! the ghost who walks. The phantom. Enemies beware, the phantom's always there, but you won't mind the phantom.